called the Religion Among Scientists in International Context Study, which has been funded by the Templeton World Charity Foundation, so we are thankful, very thankful to them. We have another initiative which is on ethics, which we're not presenting tonight, but that's funded by the National Science Foundation in the U.S. I'm going to just give you a little bit of context for this evening's conversation. I'll do some introductions, but then I'll present for about 15 or 20 minutes some data that's mainly on the religious identities and practices of scientists in the UK and India. And then we'll go on to have a little bit of a public conversation about that. I'll take a few questions about it. And then I hope that you'll stick around. I think sometimes the very best conversation is the more informal thoughts that we have in smaller groups. So we have this room until 7:30, so feel free to stay and continue to discuss these ideas and others. I am wanting to introduce my colleagues. I'm trying to look for them. So Dr. Kirsten Matthews is the co-PI of this study and is a fellow in science and technology policy. So she's in the back there, who's helping us with some public policy. She's a scientist by training. David Johnson is here. He'll raise his hand. Is a postdoctoral fellow in sociology, has a PhD, and has been very helpful in collecting data in the UK and India, as has Brandon Vaidyanathan, who is also a postdoctoral fellow at Rice University, and in particular helped us spearhead a data collection in India. And I should definitely not forget Haley Hemstreet, raise your hand please, Haley, who has helped to organize this event as well as a smaller private conference right before. So for those of you who need some convincing, the globalization of science is occurring, and I probably don't need to present data to convince you of that. Science is very much a global endeavor. When I did a study of US scientists, I knew this already going into it, but I was surprised to find that 20% of US scientists are from outside the US. Especially when we go to more elite research universities and labs. So that got me thinking that I ought to think about science much more in a global context, especially when it comes to discussions about religion and science. That if we think of these things as debates, and I don't think they should always be framed in terms of debate, but relationship between religion and science, if there is one, this takes a very different relationship, a very different character dependent on social and cultural context. And so that in part is one of the drivers for this study. There has also been a charge, and we don't know if it's necessarily true, that as science increases in a nation, that religion will decrease. And if that is the case, then scientists themselves are almost seen as a mouthpiece of that kind of movement, right? But we call it a sort of a varying sociological term, whatever that means, a sort of carrier of a kind of ideal, a class of people, scientists as carriers of secularization. If there is a conflict, a social conflict between science and religion, then that may have an impact on the public acceptance of science if religious people are perceived as being against science, as impeding particular kinds of science policies. So all that to say that there's perhaps a reason to try to map the religious identities of scientists in different global contexts. If there is a perceived secularity among scientists, it could keep religious people from going into science. We don't know that that's necessarily the case, but that's certainly an idea that's out there. Here are our general research questions. So we're interested in this piece of our research initiative in understanding the religious and practices and identities of scientists. We're also interested in the ways and contexts that religion has an impact on scientific work. We, of course, don't think that it always does, but we want to understand under what conditions it might, under what conditions scientists perhaps rightfully try to impede religion from their work, these kinds of things. How do religious identities and practices of scientists compare across national contexts? That has never really been robustly studied before, so we want to spearhead an initiative that studies just that. And we also have within our capacity in this project to understand how the religious identities and practices of scientists might compare to those of the general population which they're a part of. Here are the countries that we're studying. We are studying, of course, our own neighbors. represent varying relationships between religion and the state. They represent various developments of scientific infrastructure. They certainly have different cultural and historical contexts of religion. There's lots of reasons that make them great cases to study what scientists think about religion. You should also say this is truth in advertising. This is a deeply practical matter. We could have studied 8 different countries than these, but you have to study also where you have contacts, where you can actually carry out the study. Research is no good if you can actually carry it out. Here's our data so far. We are intending, this is our projected data, we're going to ask 22,000 scientists at various career stages from elite and non-elite research contexts across the disciplines of biology and physics to participate in our survey. We do not know if they all will, so we certainly don't anticipate we'll get 22,000 scientists in our final sample, but that's how many we're going to ask. We don't think that surveys can tell us all the story, so we also need to go to these contexts. We need to sit with scientists in their offices, in their laboratories, and try to understand what they really think, how they define religion and science, how they define the relationship between them if they think there is one. To that end, we will try to complete 700 interviews with scientists from different self-identified religious categories who are randomly selected from among those who took the survey. This is a big project. The focus for today is to try to understand what scientists in the UK and India are like religiously. This is an enormous topic. This is just the beginning, and our project is just the beginning. But we hope to begin to map this in a meaningful way that can have some kind of productive social influence. To what extent does religion shape or influence the work of scientists? And why does all of this matter? We want to begin to have a very basic conversation about that. What are the practical implications of these data? I'm going to quickly tell you about the data collection in the UK, the scientists that did respond to our survey. We have a 50% response, which is perceived to be very good in modern-day survey research. That's a final number of 1,581 scientists who participated. And I also put up there their demographic characteristics. I should say that rank 1 refers to the most junior scientists, those scientists in training. Rank 2 to scientists who have PhDs in their field. And rank 3 the most established scientists. We also have completed 99 interviews. Our goal was 100. Oh, how I hope that we had been able to get one more interview before we came to the UK. But this is not the way our research design is, so we will not be asking for volunteers for the audience. I intend to. In India, when we turn to India, we have about 40% response. The Indian context was significantly more difficult to do a survey, and I can tell you more about that in the question and answer if you're interested. This did result in a high end, which we're very pleased with. It allows us to do more robust analyses of 1,763 scientists. And you'll see there the demographic characteristics. As you can see, terrific. I would urge you to come closer if you can't actually see when I say that. We found there that there are 66% of scientists are men and 34% are women, and that does reflect a sort of the demographic character of the Indian scientific context, which of course is more male-dominated in that sense. We've collected 73 interviews in India and had just a wonderful experience doing that. Here are some of our initial findings. India and the UK are very distinct contexts. And in India, scientists, the majority are religious. And in the UK, there's only a minority who are religious. Of course, understanding the kind of complexity of meanings of religion. The characteristics of the majority religion in both countries is different. It's Christianity for the UK, and for India, it's Hinduism. And therefore, perhaps the impact of conceptions of the science and religion relationship, those different religious traditions have a very different kind of conceptualization, perhaps, of this relationship. For those who are interested, there may be some areas of overlap in the kind of concerns that science communities and religious communities have in both the UK and India. We did find some, perhaps, common concerns if we merge with other research that we collected. First, a bit of discussion about religious identity of both groups of Indian scientists and UK scientists. We see that in the UK, 65% of scientists do not think of themselves as religious at all, which is what the yellow shows, compared to 16% are Protestant of some variety. When we turn to India, 79% of Indian scientists see themselves as Hindu, and only 6% see themselves as non-religious. I should say that while only about 2% of scientists are Muslim in the UK, that the impact of Islam on science in the UK was talked about a lot by the UK scientists. So there is certainly the perception that many Muslim scientists are coming in, that Muslims are coming into science, which is sort of interesting in and of itself. Now we turn a bit to the religious practices of scientists, and there are lots of different ways of measuring this, and I'll just present one. We are interested in how scientists respond to this question, apart from weddings and funerals, about how often you participate in religious services or rituals. For India, this question was worded slightly differently. 32% of Indian scientists say they attend regularly, which we conceptualized as once a month or more, compared with 12% of UK scientists. 27% of Indian scientists attend on special holy days, compared with 9% of UK scientists. 69% of UK scientists say they never participate in religious services, compared with 19% of Indian scientists. On the whole, Indian scientists seem to be much more religious, at least according to these fairly narrow conventional measures, than UK scientists. And this does show that social context can matter, that we shouldn't think of science and religion discussion as this sort of monolithic, abstract thing, that there's some kind of value in actually going into national context, trying to, at least in an initial way, find out what's really happening. And that has been one of our goals of this project, which is very much ongoing. We also want to talk briefly about the role of religion in scientific work. Is it something that scientists are encouraging ever, or is there always a very strict boundary between one's religious identity and one's scientific work? We found that for Indian scientists, that research ethics was a very important matter, that it was a kind of orienting ethos. It was sort of a pervasive way of thinking about the world, religion that is. It was a fundamental spirit that should govern science, that there was a very pervasive sense about religion having an impact on the ethics of science in India. A good scientist, one respondent told us, does work that alleviates poverty and human suffering. For example, this biologist who's an assistant professor said, if you walk out of campus, you see a bunch of kids with no clothes on their backs. So you would think immediately, I just spent $1 million. I better get something out of it, which hopefully is useful for somebody in the future. And he was talking about a microscope that he just spent $1 million on. Of course, perhaps different from the UK context, Indian scientists see poverty right outside the windows of their institutes and laboratories. And that is a very different context that they can't help but think about it, about how their religious sensibilities might relate perhaps to the ethics of their science. Indian scientists, we did find that they talked about religion as a kind of structural impediment for women in science in particular. We can't exactly tell if this is the reason there are fewer women in science, of course, for the kind of data we collected, but we can tell you that Indian scientists sometimes talked about it. There was this phrase that came up once, the ideal Hindu housewife, that perhaps women's needing to protect the home sphere and religious participation in the home was such an important part of their role identity that perhaps was at odds with being a scientist. There's a very interesting quote from a professor of physics, who we should say that his wife was actually a physicist in his same department. But he said, my career has taken precedent. You won't like it, but it's the truth. Essentially, patriarchal society, I'm not saying what should be, I'm saying what it is. The tradition of keeping religious culture continuing, the onus is on women. Are there ways that these very initial data might begin to dispel some stereotypes in the conversation about religion and science? And here are a couple of ways that we think that they might. We found that perhaps the conflict narrative is overstated. UK and Indian scientists might perceive less conflict between religion and science, especially when it's taken from the very abstract down to actual daily practices and identities. They might perceive less conflict with religion than publicly perceived. We asked a question on our survey that said, for me personally, my understanding of science and religion can be described as one of conflict on the side of religions. They experience a conflict with the side of the religion. You'll see a very low proportion of scientists shows that. Conflict on the side of science, 38% of UK scientists chose that. So for UK scientists, there is that kind of abstract conflict for a large minority, and 18% of scientists, Indian scientists, chose that. There is this group who's in conflict but not sure what side they're on. I don't know exactly what that means. There is this huge independence group. So 45% of the UK, 44% in India, who think of them as perhaps just separate spheres. The collaboration, in the UK, 10% of scientists can see science and religion collaborating, compared to India, where 29% of scientists see science and religion collaborating. We did have scientists in the UK mention Richard Dawkins a lot. I should say that we didn't ask even one time on our interview with UK scientists what they thought about Dawkins. It just wasn't, we wanted to know what these individual scientists thought about these relationships, but they brought it up, which was very, very interesting. I had this one very funny interview with a UK scientist who said to me, I just interviewed him for an hour and a half or something. He's a really, really lovely person. And he said, Professor Ecklund, have you asked Richard about these ideas? I'm thinking, Pritchard, I usually don't think of my respondents by their first names, and I, of course, wouldn't tell the name of my respondent to this scientist. He says, Richard Dawkins, of course. I mean, I didn't even know who he was talking about at first, but clearly there's this sort of way that, that Dawkins' ideas have kind of diffused this debate. So UK scientists told us that they're tired of framing the religion and science relationship in terms of conflict. 25% of them that we interviewed referenced Dawkins even without us mentioning him. And I like this quote from this UK scientist who's a professor, said, there's no point in being Richard Dawkins and going around saying you're all stupid. And this professor talked about the ways in which this is done, even though really he agreed very much in his own religious identity with Dawkins personally, but the approach was not something that he agreed with. So that was interesting. A professor of biology, another professor of biology also said, well, I decided, well, partly he's admitting, because I thought it would sell more books, not to adopt the Dawkins-esque viewpoint. The third area that we want to talk about is, is there some kind of common ground between religious communities and scientific communities? We shouldn't ever assume that these are exclusive communities. There are scientists who are religious, who practice in religious communities, and of course, religious people enter science. So these are not exclusive communities, but we think of them as sort of archetypes of communities. There is areas of common ground, which I think people who think scientists are sort of all against religion might be surprised by some of this. Scientists are very concerned, as I said, especially in India, but also in the UK, about poverty alleviation and the ways in which their scientific work, scientists often talk to us very passionately about this, the ways in which their scientific work can be used to alleviate suffering. Sometimes in the immediate, but sometimes instead of thinking about second and third applications of their work, the ways in which scientific work might be able to alleviate poverty and suffering. And I this quote from an assistant professor of biology, she said, my sense of being a responsible scientist would be to try to answer specific questions that occur to me with the best utilization of public money. When we get money for research, it's been taken away from other things, which could have given food and shelter to some people. So she obviously takes her responsibility, her social responsibility, very seriously. Another issue that came up often among scientists was concern for the environment, and their public issue. We've seen a lot of concern for the environment, environmental care among religious communities. There might be possible collaborative overlap there. A graduate student who's a biologist says, in response to a question about why it's important for India to allow scientists to work on genetically modified crops, was this idea. He said to produce more food, to overcome adverse effects of global warming. I believe in global warming, it's affecting us, and I can see everywhere the effect of this change. And then an interesting example from a biologist who said that he sort of took a risk. He's not personally religious and decided to debate a creationist speaker on campus when asked. He said, there's a Christian society on campus and they invited a creationist speaker, and so they invited me to have a discussion with him afterwards, a public discussion where students would ask questions and he would give his view and I would give my view. The word was cut off there. So, and he talked in this interview in a very interesting way about sort of how that was a changing experience for him, to be in dialogue with religious students who had very different views than he did, not to overgeneralize that all religious students would hold creationist views, but he said that even those which were sort of most different from him he found value in conversing with them. So if there is the possibility of bridge building, it might lead to a decrease in antagonism where there is antagonism. And then this Indian professor said that spirituality makes a man soft and kind towards humanity. Spirituality helps me to understand the problem of the poor people. And he talked about the understanding that he got from his religious community and from his spiritual sensibility in order to address poverty. Those are very initial findings from this study. We still have 6 more countries to go to analyze data from. We're hoping to present workshops and conferences in most of the nations that we study. But I would love to take some questions. Maybe I can take 2 or 3 at a time and just address them. And then we'll, of course, stay around for a conversation after. Thank you so much for coming tonight. This is a real honor to have you here.